Hi everybody. I wanted to apologize again for needing to cancel last week's online session. Um, Family health problems are definitely a trying time, and I really appreciate your patience and understanding. So in this video, I'm going to do my best to cover some of what we would have during our session. The notable difference is this video is shorter, mostly because I'm trying to save you from having to watch too much of my talking, bouncing head, which is pretty hard when you can't engage as much. So this video is going to cover three main things. The first is that we're going to talk about the difference, or lack thereof, between morality and ethics, and we'll also talk a little bit about the term moral obligation. The next thing we're going to do is revisit the morality play and say a little bit about some different conceptions of happiness. This was a point that was brought up in the forums. And then finally, I'm going to give you the 1-minute rundown of utilitarianism. And this is the main thing that you should understand about the ethical view. So let's get started. The first item of business is to explain the difference between morality and ethics. I use the terms interchangeably, although some people use them differently. For some people, morality denotes an objective system of right and wrong action, where ethics is used to mean something that's closer to the way that it's used in the phrase work ethic. It's a more personalized, subjective kind of thing, and localized as well. Now, on the account where they're used differently, a moral relativist, and that's someone who believes that what's right is only relative to what an individual or a culture thinks is right, will still embrace the term ethics, but they won't find anything meaningful in discussions of morality. As I said a second ago, I and most contemporary ethicists use the term morality and ethics interchangeably, largely because I reject moral relativism. So when I use the term ethics or morality, and this will be true of most of the authors we read throughout the semester, I mean to indicate a particular kind of judgment of value that encompasses how we ought to treat things, people, animals, the environment, what have you. So this is a nice transition to talking about the term moral obligation. And on the forums, the term made many people uncomfortable. So when I or one of the other ethicists will be reading say, this person is morally obligated to do something, you can mostly understand that to mean a combination of two things. The first is to say, this person ought to do that as a matter of ethics. And secondly, it also means that ethical considerations are really important, so they trump other kinds of considerations. So the fact that you say, really want to lie to your friend will be outweighed by the fact that, ethically speaking, you shouldn't lie to your friend because the ethical consideration there wins out over your preferences in this case. Now, I think that some of the uncomfortableness of using the term moral obligation, and even just thinking about ethics generally, is that it's really hard not to feel like we're going around like the morality police, saying this person should have done that and not this, etc., and you should do this. And there is something uncomfortable, and I think usually inappropriate, about making those kinds of judgments about people. And I don't think that ethics requires us to be, or even endorses, that kind of self-righteous, I know better than thou attitude or behavior. Instead, I think ethics is a lot more about how we live our lives and the choices that we make, both individually and as a profession. I really enjoyed Jennifer's comment on the forums that we should be intentional rather than reactive. I think the point of ethics is to help you think about and understand the choices that we make, and so it just aids us in being intentional. The next thing that we're going to do is revisit the morality play quiz and then talk a little bit about happiness. Students are often, and this was the case in this session as well, very frustrated by the lack of context for the morality play. I find this interesting because as a virtue ethicist, which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, I tend to think of ethical decision making as a very different kind of process than many contemporary ethicists. So for them, ethics can sort of be boiled down to applying the right principle or principles to particular cases. And in the quiz, the examples are watered down, that is, they lack context, because they're trying to capture your sensitivity to just one or two relevant principles in each particular case. Now, regarding happiness, one of the repeated comments on the forum was to say something like, well, we all have our own views and ideas about happiness and what brings you happiness. Other people are going to disagree about that. And I wanted to work to make something a little bit more clear about that. And that's to be careful to separate out a conception of what happiness consists in, and then the particular things that might make us feel or be that way. So, for instance, it's perfectly consistent to say that happiness is all about pleasure, but then to recognize that different people enjoy different things. So there we've said something about what happiness is, all the while acknowledging that different people are made happy by different kinds of things. So when I say that if you're a utilitarian and you're trying to promote happiness, you need to understand what happiness is, I mean to say we need some kind of account like happiness is about pleasure or happiness is about preference satisfaction. But that leaves a lot of room for different people to be made happy by different sorts of things. Now, supposing that someone says that happiness is all about pleasure, and I say, no, it's not. You could plug me into an orgasm machine for the entirety of my life, but that is not happiness. Actually, that's basically the objection that Mill responds to when he introduces the higher and lower pleasures and the competent judges argument. But now we have a disagreement about what happiness consists in. But if we're going to adopt a utilitarian approach to ethics, that's probably an argument that needs to be had. If you're going to try and bring about happiness with your policies and actions, you probably need to have some basic idea about what that is, even if that leaves room for different people to be made happy by different sorts of things. The very last thing that we're going to do is distill the main idea and the process for decision making that underwrites utilitarianism. I'm going to make this short and sweet in hopes that it's easier to remember. So as a utilitarian, you think that the right choice in any situation is the one that's going to make the most happiness. And that means that when you make a decision, you have to do three main things. First, you have to ask yourself, who is affected by the decision? That's to say, whose happiness is involved. Second, you have to think about your alternatives. And finally, you have to decide which of those alternatives is probably going to make the most happiness for the people involved. That's it. Aside from the sticky question about how we ought to understand happiness, utilitarianism is actually a very simple ethical view.